In short, IRR helps us decide if a business idea is a good investment. So the steps of capital budgeting. First, a project proposal is developed. This involves either individuals or businesses looking at an opportunity to make an investment and thinking it's a good idea. Then management reviews and prioritizes projects based on their economic viability. So after looking at the potential cash flow projections, management will either decide if an investment is positive or negative for the company and thus decide to prioritize or ignore it. Then funds are allocated on these projects to ensure the development, and the results are tracked to see if the projections are accurate. If projections are inaccurate, funds are either removed, reduced, or increased. After the investment is completed, companies can reflect on the process and decide whether future similar investments should be made. So, capital cash flows. The value of an initial investment is equal to the cost of the new asset plus the installation's cost associated with the new asset minus the after-tax proceeds from selling the old asset. Keep in mind the after-tax proceeds from selling an old asset is equal to the sale price minus the tax on capital gain, which is a bit advanced for this course. But all you need to understand is that that is considered when calculating the price of the initial investment. So capital budgeting results in changes in working capital. If a current asset increases in value, it's a use of working capital. If current liabilities increase, it's a source of working capital. That means current assets are cash, or in inventory, which are uses of capital, and liabilities are things like and loans, which are sources of working capital. An increase in net working capital means it's a source of cash for the company, and a decrease is a use of cash. So, capital budgeting. The three main methods that we use to decide whether we should invest are payback period, which we'll discuss next, net present value, which we've discussed earlier, and IRR, which we've just discussed. So, payback period. It's a very basic concept, and it essentially discusses how long it takes for a company to recoup its investments on a fixed asset. So in this example, we have a Ford factory. Initially, it costs $5,000 to invest in this Ford factory. However, as the years go on, it generates positive cash flows. So payback period essentially looks at how long it takes for the company to achieve a net positive cash flow. And as you can see, initially, the cumulative cash flow is negative until year 4, when it finally breaks positive. Okay. So now let's return back to our example. Our solar panel costs $10,000. Should we make the investment? So using capital budgeting techniques, we can predict the cash flows. So the cash flows over the years are $2,000, $2,500, $3,500, $4,000, and $4,500 with an initial cost of $10,000. Should we install these panels? Well, if you look at the cost of capital, which is 12%, that means any other investment we could invest in would generate $1,200 in net present value. If our investment on these solar panels is greater than our other cost of capital, then it's a good investment. So discounting our cash flows, we can find we find that the value of the solar panels, the net present value of the solar panels is $1,219, which is greater than our cost of capital. So here we can see how we calculate our net present value and how it shifts based on our discount rate and our cash flows. So this Excel function is set up so that the discount rate is 12%, which is our cost of capital, and our cash flows are accounted for. And you can do this by typing equals NPV, selecting the discount, comma, and selecting our cash flows, which yields the same number here and here. So if we wanted to adjust our factors to see how it would be in different scenarios, we can change these numbers and see how it would work. So if our discount rate was instead of 12%, 20%, you can see how our net present value has decreased. This suggests that other investments which are better cost of capital could have been a better investment than investing in these solar panels. However, if we decrease our cost of capital to something like 5%, we see the net present value increases even greater. This shows how different costs of capital can affect the net present value of our investment by comparing alternative investments. Additionally, we can look at how cash flow affects the net present value. If our initial cash flow was 20,000 instead of 10,000, thus essentially meaning the cost was double, our net present value decreases significantly. This shows how the price of investment can also affect the value. And then increasing our cash flows significantly increases our net present value. All right, in this section, we'll be talking about macroeconomics. So first of all, what is macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is the branch of economics that studies the overall behavior of an economy, focusing on large-scale factors like economic growth, inflation, unemployment, and national income. It examines how policies and events impact the economy as a whole rather than individuals and individual businesses or individual markets. Some of the key factors in macroeconomics are the size of the economy, economic growth, government policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, inflation, and international trade. Most of these which we'll touch upon. So one thing that we should understand is the business cycle. The business cycle is very intertwined with economics. Everything is cyclical. So the business cycle, also known as the economic cycle, is the recurring pattern of fluctuations in an economy's overall activity over time. It can be divided into four main phases, as you guys can see in this diagram. In this example, it starts with the trough or the lowest point. So the trough is the lowest point in the business cycle. At this point, economic activity is at its lowest, and economic conditions are the worst. However, at this point, the economy sets the stage for a potential turnaround as it moves into the expansion stage. Some of the features of this stage is monetary and fiscal policy employed by the central banks and government, which we'll touch upon later, starting to rise in economic growth, an increase in employment and manufacturing from this trough, and a gradual shift towards increases in profits. Next, we have the expansion phase. During this phase, economic activity, such as production, employment, and consumer spending, is on the rise, as set by the trough. Businesses are expanding, and there's a general sense of optimism and an increase in consumer confidence throughout the economy. Growth is driven by an increase in consumer demand, investment, and also by monetary and fiscal policy. As you can see, the effects of fiscal and monetary policy are starting to benefit. However, the governments and central banks are drawing back on their intervention. Economic growth is also still positive. However, it's not as rapid as it was during the trough. At this stage, companies are still hiring and manufacturing activity is ongoing, and margins of companies also start to increase. Then we reach the peak. The peak is the highest point of economic activity in the business cycle. At this stage, growth begins to slow and even starts to decrease, and the economy reaches a state of maximum output. However, signs of potential inflationary pressures may begin to emerge. At this point, fiscal and monetary policies employed by the central banks and governments may go in the opposite direction to prevent too much growth, which is inflation. Additionally, economic growth stagnates, and employers have trouble finding workers, and wages increase in value. This is an effect of inflation. Additionally, earnings start to disappoint workers against high expectations due to economic growth. This leads into a recession or a contraction. So following the peak, the economy enters this contractionary phase. Economic indicators like GDP, employment, and consumer spending, which we touched upon earlier, start to decline. Businesses cut down on production, start laying off employees, and this may result in a decrease in consumer confidence. This phase is commonly referred to as a recession. However, this term varies depending on the severity and duration of this period. The business cycle is driven by various factors, including shifts in consumer and investor sentiments, increased technology, and changes to monetary and fiscal policies. However, it is continuous and it always happens. However, one thing to note is that in this graph, we see the business cycle as reaching the trough again, right? But one thing to notice is that the economy is constantly growing. So it's on an upward trend. However, these cycles go throughout the upward trend, if that makes sense. If you look closely here, the trough in the original early cycle is a bit lower than the trough after we reach the recession. This shows that the economy is growing. However, while it's growing, it is experiencing cycles. Okay, so the key factors of the macroeconomy that we'll be touching upon. GDP, or gross domestic product, employment/unemployment, inflation, and interest rates, which we've already discussed. So first, what is GDP? GDP, or the gross domestic product of a company, represents the total cost of goods being sold in that country or in that nation in a period, typically 1 year. So GDP is calculated as consumer spending, which is C, investments made, which is I, government spending, which is G, and the difference between exports and imports, which is represented as X minus M. Okay, something to note about industries and the business cycles. Certain industries and companies are divided into categories called cyclical or defensive categories. Cyclical industries are industries which face the repercussions of the business cycle. During certain times, they will be in an upward boom, and during certain times, they may not be able to operate at all. Examples of this include the hotel industry, resorts, dining, and any other excessive industries that are created by consumer wants. Defensive industries, on the other hand, are things that aren't too heavily affected by the business cycle. This is because they're necessary for human operation. Things like this include health services, utilities, health technology, and so on. However, some industries are in between cyclical and defensive. For example, consumer services are somewhat cyclical and somewhat defensive. For example, things like accommodation are cyclical and defensive to some extent. Some houses in certain areas, which may be seen as luxury, may be cyclical when it comes to renting or on Airbnb. However, basic accommodation is defensive since humans need it at all times. So first, unemployment. So unemployment is split into 3 categories: cyclical, structural, and frictional. So what is cyclical unemployment? Cyclical unemployment results from fluctuations in the overall economy. When the economy enters a recession or a downturn, demand for goods and services decreases, causing businesses to scale back production. As a result, they lay off workers, leading to cyclical unemployment. Consider the construction industry. During an economic boom, there's a high demand for new homes and infrastructural projects. Construction companies hire more workers to meet this growing demand. However, when a recession hits, the demand for new projects drops, causing these companies to cut back on their workforce, resulting in cyclical unemployment for construction workers. Similarly, in the tourism sector, when the economy is thriving, people have more disposable income to travel and explore. This leads to increased demand for flights, hotels, entertainment like movies, and so on. Yet, in an economic downturn, people tighten their budgets, leading to reduced travel and low demand for these tourism-related services. And as a result, there are losses in jobs in this industry. In both examples, cyclical unemployment is closely tied to the fluctuations in the business cycle, which we saw earlier. As the economy contracts and expands, industries that heavily rely on consumer spending and investments can experience shifts in employment levels due to the changes in demand. Next, we have structural unemployment. Structural unemployment arises from a mismatch between the skills and qualifications of job seekers and the requirements of available jobs.